we are very excited to welcome Dr. Stephanie. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for joining me here this afternoon. Art has been a part of war and warfare since the beginning of human civilization. Artworks have been made to commemorate military victory, with styles and designs that reinforce the strength and heroism of the soldiers and the nobility and justice of their cause. Art can also imply, directly or indirectly, that your opponent was vicious, cowardly, barbaric, or even evil. Since art is a luxury good, unnecessary for simple human survival, the ability of one side to make an artwork after the war is over also shows their power, proving that not only did they survive the war, but they emerged successfully with their culture, money, and sense of self intact. Artworks often imply that one side of the conflict was in the right, that God, or the gods, supported you. Now, this is not news, I think, to many of you. Much of the art that fills textbooks and museums today falls into this long tradition of art and war, and you can see two much more recent examples here. But when I say that art and war have been entangled since the beginning of human civilization, I do mean that. This artwork, known today as the Stele of the Vultures and on display at the Louvre Museum in Paris, was made in ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was the land of the first cities and civilizations in the world, roughly equivalent to the southern part of modern Iraq in the Middle East. Here you can see artworks, there was Mesopotamia, sorry. Here you can see artworks from Uruk, the first city in the world. The Stele of the Vultures monument dates to about 4,500 years ago, not long after the invention of writing, which you can see here. And the inscription on the stele is written in Sumerian, the world's first and oldest written language. The monument commemorates the victory of one city, Lagash, over the neighboring city of Umma in a dispute about agricultural land and water rights. And you can see the two cities are close neighbors here on the map. But while the actual war and its motivations were fairly banal, pretty run-of-the-mill stuff to be fighting over, this stele elevates this basic human conflict to a heroic and godlike plane. The Ensi, or ruler of Lagash, a man named Eonatum, is a peerless leader and hero. He stands or rides alone in front of his numberless yet well-organized army of soldiers. In contrast, the enemy is a useless rabble, soon to be turned into a pile of corpses, their decapitated heads carried away to be torn apart and eaten by the flock of vultures that give the stele its modern name. And there's a good close-up of the vultures taking away the heads. On the back of the stele, the Sumerian god Girsu, who is associated with both war and agriculture, holds the captive soldiers of Umma in a battle net. The god's feelings toward the losing city are clear. The prisoner of war who attempts to escape from the net, right there, is having his head bashed in for this trouble. He's being punished by a swift blow to the head with God's mace. Now, this monument is a valuable record of history. We know about this war today quite simply because the stele survives. But this artwork was also much more than just a historical document. It was propaganda, proof positive of not only Lagash's victory, but also of their heroism, the justice of their cause, the gods' approval for their actions, and their city's continued financial good fortune and stability. Already, with one of the very first and oldest war monuments in human history, remember, 4,500 years ago, this complex layering of messages was possible in art. But because of this close connection between art and warfare, the power of art to communicate both the history and the propaganda of war, this also means that art is uniquely vulnerable and has been a prime target of wartime violence and destruction, again, almost since the beginning of civilization. For instance, you can see here a victory monument of the Persian king Darius I, in which he shows all the lands that he conquered, including lands such as Egypt and East Greece, supporting him as tiny figures, like this one, this is a blow-up, the tiny figures that surround the base of the statue, literally holding up his feet as he is stepping on them. But 150 years later, that monument was deliberately damaged and used as target practice by the Greek and Macedonian army of Alexander the Great, who conquered the Persians. We can see here that bragging about your victories in artwork, honoring and elevating your kings and soldiers and monuments entails a certain amount of risk. The facts of history can never be changed, but a statue can be toppled, it can be mutilated, it can be turned into dust. One twist of fate, the winners become the losers, and that complex package of powerful, positive messages that you carved into a monument becomes an easy target and a place for those messages to be unmade. Destroying your enemy's artwork demonstrates your power while challenging theirs. It can also be easy revenge, allowing you to travel back in time and physically injure or destroy the body of a long-dead soldier or king who hurt your people decades or centuries ago. This is psychological warfare. The wins and losses, the injuries and suffering that is a strategy of war that does not involve or doesn't have to involve any actual bloodshed or killing of living people. And artworks and monuments have been involved in this kind of warfare, again, almost since the beginning of civilization. While the entire world was shocked and appalled over the last few decades by the ways that terrorist groups in the Middle East, such as the Taliban and ISIS, destroyed so many artworks and archaeological sites, this is not a new phenomenon, unfortunately. It has been part of the psychology and terror of war for millennia. And I think to understand the complexity of what the Taliban and ISIS did, what motivated them, why it affects us so much, and why it quite possibly might happen again, we should examine what happened alongside some of these ancient precedents. So I'm going to do so, kind of organizing it along 5 different motivations that ISIS and the Taliban have had, looking at it alongside some of those ancient precedents. All right, so why destroy artworks and archaeological sites? Reason number 1 that I'm going to talk about. Destruction is forever. Destroying a visible symbol gives a lasting power. In 490 BCE, the Persian Empire invaded Greece in an attempt to punish the Greek city-states for assisting their citizens, their cities, at least ones they controlled, in a rebellion. So Persia over here, coming across here over into the relatively tiny area of mainland Greece. Yet, against all odds with this first invasion, a tiny Greek force defeated the Persians at the Battle of Marathon. Stung by this defeat, Persia collected its forces and mounted a much larger scale land invasion of mainland Greece in 480 BCE. So, Marathon, much larger invasion. Despite the heroism of 300 Spartan warriors and their allies at the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persians quickly overcame the Greek forces and swept down into southern Greece, destroying as they went. The people of Athens evacuated in time, but the city itself was ransacked and ruined by the Persian forces. Houses burned, pottery shattered, grave monuments and statues overturned and smashed. You can see some of those statues here in the Acropolis Museum in Athens, where they're often missing their limbs or their heads due to damage caused by the Persians during that invasion. Perhaps the most painful and significant destruction caused by the Persians was that the sacred temples to Athena on the Acropolis were looted and torn down. Although the Greeks would win the Persian wars about a year later, and the Athenians would return to their city and ultimately rebuild their homes and temples, including the Parthenon, in grand classical style as you see it now, the grief over this loss of artworks, buildings, and monuments was vivid, it was real. It can be felt in the oaths sworn by the soldiers on the battlefield of Plataea, the last victory of the war. Called the Plataean Oath, it's there on the screen. The rough translation is that I swear never to rebuild the shrines and temples burned and sacked by the barbarians, but to leave them in ruins forever as a memorial to the impiety of the despoilers. Of course, they did eventually decide to rebuild, obviously. But they always kept a section of the ruins of the earlier temple visible and protected as a reminder of what the Persians had done. And this mourning, this sense of loss, was what the Persians had intended. One of the reasons that this suffering is so real when an artwork or building is destroyed, both in classical Athens and today, is that the loss is so visible and communal, affecting the whole society. Killing humans is awful, the worst possible thing, horrible in the moment, but the whole society often doesn't see the loss of human life. They don't feel it in the landscape forever the way you do with that symbol, that building or monument. I think we all, in some way, have an expectation that the monuments, cities, buildings we live with, especially the big and important ones, will outlive us in some way, lasting beyond our lifetimes, maybe even lasting forever. So destroying a building, a monument, a symbol, is an attempt to destroy that community, to kill not just individuals, but a whole civilization and a way of life. And that destruction is forever, even if they rebuild it, even if it is better next time, as Parthenon arguably is. It is not the same. We all know this and experience this as well. In the shocking and terrible terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, 2,977 people were killed. Each one of those deaths is a horrible tragedy. But we lost more than just those individual people. As a community of Americans, we also lost the Twin Towers, an iconic pair of buildings from the New York skyline. And that loss symbolized the fear, the tragedy, and the threat to our way of life, in a manner that was and is still very visible and concrete. In contrast, every time I drive on Highway 75, I notice those scrolling notification signs that inform us of the recent death tolls due to car accidents on Texas roads. Last year, 3,893 people were killed, more than on 9/11. And that is not even to speak of our current situation with COVID, where I think last year we were experiencing 9/11 every couple of days. But we commemorate those deaths differently. We've chosen to commemorate those deaths differently, make them private tragedies more than public ones, in part, I think, because 9/11 took more than individual people from us. The destruction of a building, of a symbol, was a way to inflict a psychological wound on an entire country. Now, obviously, terrorist groups know the psychological injury of this kind of destruction, since one of those groups was who perpetrated the attack on 9/11. But this is also happening to people in the Middle East as well. This is not something that only happens in America or elsewhere. This is happening to people in the Middle East. Many of the destructions wrought by the Taliban and ISIS were directed at local people in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, particularly people who believed in different versions of Islam or different religions altogether, such as Buddhism. Of course, such destructions were not undertaken in isolation. Murder, kidnapping, torture, and other sorts of physical violence were also meted out against these local people. But in addition to these individual tragedies, the destruction of monuments, buildings, and symbols were a way, a very effective way, to affect an entire community, even those who lived outside the borders of direct Taliban or ISIS control, and to eradicate that belief system and that way of life. It was also an attempt to make that destruction permanent. The monuments they destroyed are lost forever. All right, reason 2, create. Why do we destroy, why do terrorist groups destroy artwork and archaeological sites? To create a record of destruction, which gives them enduring power and generates generational trauma. It is one thing to destroy a building, monument, or other symbol of cultural heritage. That is painful enough. But if that destruction is recorded, if a permanent record of the initial act of violence is created, it can cause enduring trauma. The initial moment of violence is experienced through the artwork again and again, even by people who were not present, or perhaps not even born, when the tragedy happened. Turn to another ancient example. Following from our Stele of the Vultures example at the beginning, not long afterwards, a new ethnic group called the Akkadians took power in southern Mesopotamia. This monument commemorates a victorious war undertaken by one of their kings, named Naram-Sin, who is the central and largest figure on the monument. You can see it here, it's in the Louvre in Paris now. So there's Naram-Sin right there. His orderly rows of troops march up the mountain behind him, and the defeated enemy lie dead, dying, or run away from him. Although excavated at the Iranian city of Susa, and we'll come back to that in a minute, the monument was originally set up in Sippar, a Mesopotamian city sacred to Shamash, their sun god. You can see the sun symbols in the sky above Naram-Sin and the mountains, indicating the sun god's support. The battle itself, depicted on the stele, took place in the Zagros Mountains of Iran, where Naram-Sin fought a semi-nomadic people called the Lulubi, to gain control over their natural resources of metal and stone. Naram-Sin records the name of his enemy in the monument's inscription, which is now fragmentary. In the inscription, he also indicates that his own name is divine, and he wears the horned headdress that was the traditional headdress of the Mesopotamian gods. You can see an example here, and here he is wearing it in the close-up of the stele. The message is pretty clear. The winner, Naram-Sin, is beloved by the gods, and perhaps even a minor god himself, while the defeated enemy is a worthless corpse trampled beneath his foot, and there's actually a couple of them that he is stepping on. But what made this monument particularly powerful, and to the defeated Lulubi particularly painful, is how the artwork was not just a depiction of the war, but also a real-world record of it. Not only did Naram-Sin win the battle and take the resources of the Zagros Mountains as raw materials, but he also took this very piece of pink sandstone from these people's mountainous homeland back to the lowlands of Mesopotamia with him. Upon it, he carved the image of the Lulubi's defeat, using their own homeland against them. Now, in the days before documentary war photography, CNN, and Twitter, Naram-Sin's people back in Mesopotamia had no way of really knowing what was happening far away in Iran during this king's war. Using a looted and stolen piece of stone to tell the story made the record authentic. It made it real. It was proof. It was a record. It also made it a source of enduring pain to the people of the Zagros Mountains, the Lulubi, and later their descendants, the Elamites. About 1,000 years later, the Elamites of Iran, descendants of the Lulubi, would conquer southern Mesopotamia. They would find this monument still on public display, recognize their ancestors' suffering, and then take it back to Iran with them, to Susa, where the archaeologists would eventually find it. Now, in the intervening 1,000 years, the people of Iran had developed a sophisticated culture of their own. And so here they are over here in Iran, the Elamites. They built their own massive temple ziggurats. They had their own monumental art and statuary traditions. But the pain of what the Akkadian kings had done 1,000 years earlier had either never really faded or quite possibly was re-inflamed, was made painful all over again by the surviving visual record, the stele of Naram-Sin. And we can see this pain quite vividly because the Elamites recarved the monument to add what we call the shouting inscription. I don't know if you can see it, but this Lulubi was supposed to be kind of crying out, "I surrender, I'm running away," has been given a new inscription coming out of his mouth here 1,000 years later by his descendants. You can see the lines of text going up out of his open mouth. And in that inscription, sorry, I know that's unfortunately not large enough, but I'll read out part for you. The current Elamite king puts his voice into the mouth of his long-dead ancestor, declaring, "I am Shutrak Nahunta. I struck down Sippar. I took the stele of Naram-Sin in my hand. I carried it off. I brought it back to Elam." Dwell on that for a second. I brought it back. I brought it back. The pain of loss, the pain of having part of your homeland destroyed, was still there over 1,000 years later. And the record of that destruction, seeing it vividly on the stele of Naram-Sin itself, made that pain alive again and made it more vivid. Now you may be thinking, that's sort of an interesting story, but what does this have to do with Taliban and ISIS? Well, quite a lot, I would say. The Taliban, and particularly ISIS, did not just destroy part of people's homelands, their historical sites, their houses of worship, their art, their monuments. They documented themselves doing it. This characteristic feature of recent artwork destructions by Middle Eastern terrorist groups, particularly ISIS, is what distinguishes these acts from being simply a rejection of idolatry, a desire to get rid of images and prevent idol worship. Now, many analysts and commentators, indeed often the spokesmen for the Taliban and ISIS themselves, talk about such image destructions as if they were motivated by that sense of religious fundamentalism and purity alone. And I do not doubt that iconoclasm, this desire to destroy images and idols, is part of what they were doing. But But if these terrorists were motivated only and completely by a desire to get rid of statues, get rid of images, destroy them forever so no one would see them or worship them, why didn't they do it completely, systematically, silently? Instead, they recorded it, which made the images of the destroyed artworks and the act of destruction immortal and even more widely seen. The images of these so-called idols living forever now on the internet. So it can be iconoclasm, but it can also be something else in addition to that. And you can see this is still from a video where you can see how many of them are recording. There's more people recording, honestly, than there are damaging things. So there's a reason for this. This is not random. This was intentional. This was motivated. When ISIS created a record of what they destroyed, it was also about provoking that same sort of lasting generational trauma that Naram Sin accomplished when he carved the defeat of the Lulubi on a mangled, looted piece of their own homeland. You win a battle once, you destroy a statue once. That moment passes. But if you record it, it lives forever. And it shows your power forever, traumatizing your victims and their descendants for potentially thousands of years. The ancient Romans were also well aware of the power of the visual record of destructions. This monument, the Arch of Titus, still stands today in Rome. It was erected as a victory monument to the Roman Emperor Titus, seen here, and it celebrated one of his most famous achievements, the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. You can see in this slide, which is a close-up of one of the relief panels from inside the Arch of Titus, still visible today, the Roman soldiers bringing the menorah and other sacred items from the Jewish temple into Rome. The original Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, also known as the First Temple, had been destroyed centuries earlier by the Babylonians, but the same site, known today as the Temple Mount, seen here, was used by the Jewish people to build the Second Temple, which you can see here in a reconstruction. This is the temple as it would have looked during the time of Jesus, and this was the temple that the Roman Emperor Titus destroyed. That destruction alone was devastating, but the recording of it on this arch kept that memory and that trauma particularly vivid and alive. We can still see evidence of that in how images from the Arch of Titus are used by modern Jewish groups who are hopeful that perhaps the Vatican, inheritor of many of ancient Rome's treasures, might still have the original menorah from the temple which they could return. I think that's very unlikely. But there's still hope, and in part because the Romans recorded as, hey, we took it. Many Jews today also refuse to walk under the Arch of Titus, not wanting to participate or collaborate in this celebration of their most sacred temples being destroyed. I think both of these examples, Naram Sin stealing and the Arch of Titus, are particularly instructive because they show us how through the act of recording warfare atrocities, the perpetrators can continue to make that violence felt, that trauma be handed down through generations, sometimes literally for thousands of years. In the short term, as the Akkadians and Romans also knew, destroying artworks can be a very effective way to destroy your enemy, to wipe out religious beliefs and ethnicities, any sense of culture and community, and people who do not conform to your values. But if you record yourself doing it, you can make that pain last. Obviously, it has only been a very few years since the world was forced to witness ISIS recording itself doing the same thing. But I and many others think that they were very aware of the long-term power of the photographs and videos that they took, potentially having the ability to hurt people for millennia. And this was a power that they wanted. All right, why do terrorist groups destroy artworks and archaeological sites? Reasons 3. Artworks can betray you. If your art is valuable to your enemies, it can be seen as corrupted or even traitorous. Our first two explanations for why the Taliban and ISIS destroy archaeological sites, monuments, and artworks have concentrated primarily on the pain they caused and the power they exercise over the local population in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Now I would like to turn our attention to how and why they were attempting to cause pain to the rest of the world, particularly those of us who live in the so-called West of Europe and North America. And again, I will illustrate some of these motivations for psychological warfare using ancient examples. In the same family of the Akkadian kings, such as Naram-Sin, we saw just a few minutes ago, was another king. This is potentially either him or his grandfather Sargon, who had this magnificent copper statue made of himself. The statue is a masterpiece with soft naturalism in the curve of the nostril and delicate modeling around the eyes, contrasted with an explosive eruption of curls in the beard that looked rigid and metallic. That lack of naturalism in the beard was intentional. In a culture where power was defined by testosterone-fueled masculinity, the king needed to stand apart by his ability to sport a manly beard so full, so curly, so magnificent that literally no other man could grow it. This statue was so admired that hundreds of years later, when southern Mesopotamia was conquered by their neighbors to the north, the Assyrians, those conquerors took the statue with them back to their own capital city to admire it. Indeed, not only did these foreign conquerors admire the statue, but the statue was so beloved that its form and style were used as the inspiration for new local Assyrian artworks of their own heroic figures. In other words, the Assyrians made the Akkadian statue their own. Well, a few centuries later, the Assyrian Empire fell, overthrown by two of the nations they had conquered, the Babylonians and the Medes, who allied together. The Babylonians of southern Mesopotamia were the descendants of the Akkadians, and when they invaded Assyria, were they excited to see their statue? Were they excited to see this masterpiece of their own cultural heritage and eagerly claim it and bring it back? No, they were not. It seems that they recognized the statue, but they were not excited to see it. They did not rescue it. They did not take it home. They did not destroy it either. You could melt it down and reuse the copper. It's valuable. But instead, they mutilated it. They gouged out the eyes, they cut off the end of the nose, and they chopped off the ears. This was the standard treatment for a living human traitor, a turncoat. But this punishment was given to a statue that they believed had betrayed its people, betrayed its culture and homeland, because it was beloved by their enemy. We can see a similar example in sacred Jewish objects taken by the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III when he conquered the area of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Here you can see those Egyptian conquests on the map as Egypt extended its control of the New Kingdom up into that region of the Middle East. One of the hardest fought battles of the Egyptian invasion was against the Jewish city of Megiddo, which sat at a major crossroads and trade routes, and so was a highly desirable city to control. You had taxes, travelers, money. Indeed, the city was fought over, so desired it was fought over all the time, so often that the root of the biblical word Armageddon, the end of the world, comes from the name Megiddo. You can hear it, the M-G-D-D, Megiddo, Armageddon, because the Jews believed that the war to end the world would of course start at Megiddo, because all wars started at Megiddo. Well, Thutmose fought long and hard to capture this city, leading the army personally as recounted in the Egyptian annals. The city walls of Megiddo were strong, and the Egyptian army had to lay siege to the city for 7 months, but were eventually able to capture it. They captured booty and spoils of war, which they eagerly brought back to the temple at Karnak in Egypt. On the walls of the temple, Pharaoh Thutmose depicted himself conquering the people as well as dedicating their sacred objects to the Egyptian sun god, Amun-Ra. So here he is. There you can see him dedicating. This is a line drawing, a little easier to see. There he is over there on the left. And here's a massive amount of objects that he is dedicating to Amun-Ra. The inscriptions give the details of all of these rich treasures that the Pharaoh had taken from the Israelites, which were also sculpted and painted in great detail. And you can see some more. Originally would have been painted. You can see a few traces of paint before being presented to the Egyptian god. Of course, repurposing Jewish objects, especially sacred ones, to serve an Egyptian god was heresy. It's a great betrayal. And we can see that this was deeply felt by the Jewish people centuries later. Indeed, somewhere between 600 to 1,000 years later, the invading empires of Assyria and Persia both included Jewish military units. And when those Jewish forces invaded the Egyptian temple and saw this relief, they hacked away the pharaoh's face and hands, carving Thutmose's name out of his inscription onto the obelisks, as you can see on the left. But they also carved away their most sacred objects out of the relief. Those objects had betrayed their people, had betrayed the Jewish God, and therefore should no longer exist. Now, how does this relate to the modern situation of the Taliban and ISIS? Because many of their members also believe that their culture, their heritage, has betrayed them, because it is valued by their enemy and is valued by us. It is Western culture that has invented the academic discipline of archaeology, has popularized it, whether in the fictional version of Indiana Jones or the real-life history of European and American archaeologists, explorers, colonizers, who dug up these ancient sites in the first place. Now, to be extremely clear, there are a great many, an enormous number of people who live in the Middle East who value their archaeological heritage, and who themselves are trained as archaeologists and art historians, and brilliantly so. But to other people in the Middle East, including members of these terrorist groups, archaeology, even their own archaeology, is synonymous with the West, because we made a big fuss about going and digging it up and taking it. Starting over 200 years ago, we have been the ones digging it up, as you can see here. And here, we have taken it back to our homes, to our cities and museums, put it on display. Here it is in the British Museum. It is still there today in cities like Paris and New York, and this is me a week ago. Here I am with the map. By and large, it is us, it is the West, who has declared that archaeology is valuable. The moral heritage sites said that these artworks matter. And so to the members of these Middle Eastern terrorist groups who have said quite clearly that the West is their enemy, because their heritage is beloved by the enemy, it too is somewhat corrupted. It has betrayed them. And ISIS in particular has said as much. The unbelievers had unearthed these statues and ruins in recent generations and attempted to portray them as part of a cultural heritage and identity that the Muslims of Iraq should embrace and be proud of. In some ways, they're encouraging the people of Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, don't see it as your history, it's theirs. They see it as ours. And so where I am happily taking pictures with Assyrian statues in New York City, terrorist groups are smashing them. They're trying to get rid of this connection to hurt me by hurting the statues. They're destroying what they can to destroy our hold on their past and on their culture. And this is a place where I think that if we don't want this to continue or to happen again, that many Western scholars, and I include myself in this, as well as museums, could be a lot more careful with how we present this material. I think, for instance, that this exhibit a few years ago in Italy that was intended to show that the West still values ancient art and archaeology, even if ISIS was blowing it up, rising from destruction. And I think this quote here by the curator was really well-intentioned. It is our heritage, not only the Syrian or Iraqi or Afghan, it's a universal heritage. I think that was really well meant. And I think it's also hugely problematic. It is this mindset, this ownership that somehow many of us feel entitled to claim over all of the ancient world, whether it belonged to our own personal ancestors or personal culture or not, is what ISIS and the Taliban and many of these terrorist groups are reacting against. And so I think that we, and I very much implicate myself in this, could be a lot more careful to say that we are caretakers of this past, these collections, rather than the owners. That we steward the knowledge of this civilizations, rather than control it. And I should note that it is not just me saying this. Many of the most prominent museums, including the Met in New York, are in the process of making this shift. It is the more honest and ethical thing to do, and honestly, it is also the safer course of action. Because if we make this archaeology too much our own, if we claim it, then both us and the archaeology are vulnerable. All right, reason 4, why do terrorists destroy artworks and archaeological sites? Reason number 4, revenge against statues. Violence against art as a proxy for retribution against people. Destroying or damaging artworks in war can also be a way of simply getting revenge for what you experienced or perceived as a past injustice. There are many examples of this kind of artwork destruction from the ancient world. One particularly vivid example comes from yet another conflict between the people of Mesopotamia, in this case the Assyrians who lived in the north against the Elamites in Iran. The Assyrians conquered the Elamites and killed the Elamite king Teomon in the Battle of Tiltuba, seen here in an enormous and magnificent wall relief. None of the photos do justice. It's huge. It's like, yeah, almost as long as this thing. The relief is incredibly detailed, and to zoom in on the left side, you can see the orderly ground lines, sort of right here, giving some definition to the frenzied fighting on the battlefield. But on the right side of the relief, that order devolves into complete chaos, and on the far right side, you can see the wavy ripples and swimming fish of the river Ulai. Fish, clogging the river, clogged thick with the corpses of fallen soldiers and horses. In the midst of this chaos, the Elamite king Teomon and his son, the crown prince, were hunted down and killed by common Assyrian foot soldiers, and the Assyrian artwork is very clear about this, recording in both text and picture format the graphic detail of how the two Iranian royals were beheaded in front of each other. Here, the red arrow is pointing to where this is taking place in the relief, deliberately disguised in the midst of the battle scene, a kind of gory "Where's Waldo" search, where's the dead king? To show that the death of the enemy king was lowly, it was commonplace, it was lacking in nobility. Elsewhere in the panel, the soldier is shown riding away in a chariot, bringing the decapitated head of the Elamite king back to Assyria. And here you can see it slightly closer up. Notice in the text that accompanies it that it is the Assyrian king that is speaking. They are bringing him the good news by sending it to Assyria. And so the king is clearly not there. So the victorious king is not there in Iran at the head of his army. Instead, he is back home in Assyria. And what was he doing back home in Assyria? He was enjoying a pleasant afternoon of wine drinking with his wife, reclining on elegant furniture with a blanket draped over his lap and a luxurious garden filled with flowers and birds. He wasn't busy. He just didn't bother to show up for his own war. And this is a deliberate insult to his enemy. How do we know that this is part of the same story? Because the decapitated head of the Elamite king Teomon, oozing with blood and several days old at this point, is hanging and rotting like a disgusting Christmas ornament from the branches of one of the trees in his garden. The insult here is clearly intentional. And when the descendants of the Elamites helped the Babylonians overthrow the Assyrians just a few years later, that insult was remembered. If you look carefully at this relief, you can see that the faces of both the king and queen are damaged, deliberately pecked out. The king's cup, too, has been gouged out of his hand. This is not random damage. This is revenge. The servants' faces have been left intact. Indeed, even the soldiers who did the deed have been left unharmed. Perhaps at least they were fighting bravely. No, it was the Assyrian royalty themselves who were to blame, and that's where the revenge was targeted. Even artworks unrelated to a war itself can be targeted for this kind of revenge. About 300 years after the Assyrian king's face was pecked out, Alexander the Great justified his invasion and conquest of the Persian Empire and the defeat of Persia's king Darius III as revenge for the Persian wars against Greece and the sack of Athens. After Alexander conquered Persia and entered their capital city Persepolis in triumph, he had the palaces burned. Even today, you can still see traces of that burning in the charred, blackened surfaces of many of the columns of Persepolis. Any artwork or building that is a symbol that is important and meaningful to your enemy is a place to potentially take revenge. Now, how does this relate to ISIS and the Taliban? Who are they trying to get revenge against and why? Again, in large part, the answer is the West. Rightly or wrongly, there is a lot of anger among many people in the Middle East, I think rightly, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, for intervention there by the West over centuries, from the colonization of the British Empire to the much more recent wars led in large part by the United States. Now, I am not a military, obviously not a military strategist or a political scientist, and I know that the political and military situation in the Middle East is incredibly complicated. But I want to acknowledge that there are many people in the Middle East, including innocent people, who have suffered in those conflicts and are angry. And if you are an average person living in a place like Iraq or Syria, it is easy to see that one of the things the United States cares about, and one of the places to take revenge on the US, if you are so inclined, is to target archaeological sites. That's one of the main things that when we go over there, we protect and we occupy and we patrol. We clearly care about history and about ruins. The site of Palmyra was a particularly vulnerable place, particularly susceptible to this kind of revenge because it fits very well into the Western ideal of archaeology and ruins. It's a beautiful ruin. Situated on the eastern extent of the Roman Empire, sometimes a part of the Roman Empire proper, it's there in the blue, sometimes an allied or client kingdom, Palmyra's art and architecture beautifully expresses its participation in the classical world. While there were many local influences at Palmyra, a lot of the city looks classical. It looks Roman. Archways, columns with Corinthian capitals, this was the visual language of the Mediterranean, of Greece, of Rome. And it is a visual language, a look, a style that an enormous number of institutions in the West have continued to value and use. We make our halls of government look like this, our banks, our museums, our great universities. Do you want to make a building look important in this country? Do you want it to look serious and consequential? Then you put some classical Roman architecture into it. You put some Palmyra into it. To many people in the West, Palmyra isn't just important to us because it's archaeology. It's important to us because it is us. It looks familiar. It looks like our heritage, even if your ancestors weren't personally from Syria. Another reason that Palmyra was unfortunately a perfect place for revenge is that because this ancient region, this ancient culture, shares many of the same values that the modern West claims to uphold. It was a diverse society, multicultural, blended, tolerant. The same was true of the neighboring city of Doriaropus, which was excavated by Yale, and you can see many of the artifacts in the Yale Art Museum. This was me there 2 weeks ago. At this city, there was a Roman temple to the god Mithras, sponsored by the military men from Palmyra. But in the same city, there was a beautiful, ornate Jewish synagogue, as well as one of the oldest surviving Christian churches. This is a wall painting from that church, which shows Christ healing a paralyzed man on the left panel, and Christ walking on water on the right panel. It's right down there. This may be the oldest depiction of Jesus in the world. If you want to see it, it's at Yale. Christian pilgrims go there all the time, as well as art historians. This cultural diversity was echoed at Palmyra, where one of the most recognizable and unique type of artworks were sculptural portrait grave reliefs. The idea of putting your portrait on a grave, taking pride in your own face and calling out for recognition from living people who were passing by, was a characteristically Roman funerary tradition. But the ornate headdress and jewelry, the Aramaic inscription over her shoulder that records her name, were very much a part of local culture. This kind of cultural blending and tolerance aligns quite well with modern Western values, and we celebrate them, putting them again in our museums. And another close-up here. So unfortunately, Palmyra was a perfect place to take revenge. And here, iconoclasm, I think, in some ways had very little to do with it, because most of what ISIS destroyed was architecture with no images, columns that would not be offensive to any version of Islam, no matter how strict. And the manner in which they destroyed it was designed to elicit maximum pain, maximum revenge, a slow drip, drip, drip equivalent to psychological torture. When ISIS first captured Palmyra, it initially seemed that they would not destroy anything. On May 27, 2015, ISIS released an 87-second video showing parts of the apparently undamaged ancient colonnades, the Temple of Bel, and the Roman Theater. But on June 27, 2015, just 1 month later, the Lion of Allah statue was destroyed. Several other statues were also purposely destroyed. The statue may be able to be restored. We shall see. On October 30th, 2015, again 2 months later now, ISIS demolished the 1st century Temple of Bel with explosives. Satellite imagery of the site taken shortly after showed almost nothing remaining except for a single gateway. Here you can see the before and after satellite photos from above. Before on top, below on the bottom. UNESCO, the UN's Cultural Heritage Organization, calls the destruction of the temple a war crime. Between August 27th and September 2nd, 2015, ISIS also destroyed several of Palmyra's ancient tombs, including the 2nd century AD Tower of El-Abel, called the most prominent example of Palmyra's distinctive funerary monuments. And in October 2015, the monumental Great Arch of Palmyra was destroyed. After being briefly pushed out by the Syrian army, ISIS returned to Palmyra in March 2016 and destroyed many of the statues in the museum. Each of these destructions is horrific, but it is worth noticing the timeline. It took place over many months. This was slow, calculated, designed to keep the world in suspense, in terror. Just how much damage would they do? And therefore calculated to exact maximum revenge. Now, as I point out the damage that ISIS was attempting to do to the West with the destructions at Palmyra, I want to again reinforce that ISIS, the Taliban, these other terrorist groups do not speak for everyone in the Middle East, not even close. They would like to, but we would be letting them win if we assumed that they did. There are many local people who quite bravely and heroically defended their people's history and cultural heritage, even despite being tortured and murdered. Others worked in secret to hide and protect cultural objects, keeping them safe. Many of these stories will not be fully told for decades, but I assure you that they are there. Local people, Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, who are willing to work, risk everything, and possibly die to keep their culture alive. What ISIS and the Taliban did hurt them likely far more than it hurt most of us. But we should make no mistake that it was calculated to hurt us too. They want these headlines about the destructions of precious monuments, and we can't see it, 20 precious monuments, right? They want CNN to say this. They want us to do things like recreate copies of what they have destroyed, copies that will never be the lost original, to show how angry and upset we are, because that shows their revenge is working and it gives them power. Now, while I want to be clear that us being upset is not our fault, it's understandable, I was upset. But if we want to prevent future Middle Eastern terrorist groups from targeting archaeological sites, we might want to be more careful about showing our outrage and showing our grief, rushing to commemorate and reconstruct at the very moment the conflict is still happening and the terrorists are an immediate threat. We can feel the loss, yes, but be aware that they are manipulating us and perhaps try harder not to play to their hand. I would like to end my lecture by discussing one final reason why terrorist groups such as the Taliban and ISIS destroy archaeological sites and artworks, and that is a financial one. To bolster demand by creating artificial scarcity, and then feeding that demand with a supply of looted artworks. We have solid evidence that ISIS in particular conducted archaeological looting in order to make money off of the antiquities market. They organized the diggers and acted as intermediaries in order to sell ancient artworks, cuneiform tablets, statues, and other objects into the hands of dealers, which then went into the hands of largely unsuspecting, or maybe some of them suspecting, buyers, such as galleries, museums, and private collectors. Evidence of their widespread and systematic looting is in part coming from satellite footage, where professionally excavated archaeological sites, such as Dura Europos, were turned into a ravaged mess, pockmarked with looters' pits like the surface of the moon. These diggers caused the damage, but they would never profit off of it without the intermediaries, including terrorists, orchestrating the selling. And I note up there, right? Local mafia, other criminal organizations. This is not exclusive to terrorists, but terrorist groups are very able to and willing to get in this game. Those famous funerary portraits from Palmyra we were just looking at were among the looted objects, showing that ISIS was quite capable of, on the one hand, destroying or blowing up something, usually a big showy building or a very large statue that couldn't be moved, while at the same time, with the other hand, saving an object, usually a smaller, more portable object, to sell on the antiquities market. Then it would go into this pipeline, moving progressively further away from the Middle East, away from the violence, and would often end up with a gallery, museum, or private collector in the West. The news headlines that ISIS was getting incentivized this. They made Palmyra and these other sites even more famous, and they threatened them, which drove up prices, money that went back into the pockets of terrorists. And we know this. There are many records that have since been discovered that show that ISIS systematized archaeological looting. It was part of their organizational structure. They taxed it. You had to apply for a permit. This was not a ragtag, disorganized operation. They knew exactly what they were doing. They kept receipts. They kept records of their revenue with percentages. And not only were they doing this all alongside the destruction, evidence indicates that this revenue stream was actually a motivation for their actions. By destroying the monuments in very public, very documented ways where the whole world could watch, they made the monuments famous, and they showed how threatened this artwork is. Buy it today, might be gone tomorrow. Don't you want to buy it? This is what economists call creating an artificial scarcity. Blowing up Palmyra's large architecture, which could never be exported and sold, it's too big, so that the smaller artworks would fetch an even higher price on the antiquities market. And unfortunately, this part of the process is not over. ISIS may officially be gone, or it may be transforming into something else. But the threat to Palmyra may right now have been eased for the moment. But many of the terrorists, the men who participated in these horrific acts of destruction, are still very much alive. And they are counting on the West's continued interest in archaeology to fund their retirement. We have good intelligence that so many more looted antiquities from Iraq and Syria are just waiting in free ports in countries like Switzerland. One by one, over the years and decades, these objects will be sold to dealers, to auction houses, given phony paperwork, made to look clean, passed along to museums and collectors, who are, perhaps unwittingly, sending thousands or even millions of dollars back into the pockets of terrorists. As I close this lecture, I wish to acknowledge the horrible human rights abuses and loss of human life that Middle Eastern terrorist groups such as the Taliban and ISIS have committed, both in their own countries and around the world. Speaking for myself, as someone who loves archaeology and has dedicated my life and career to the study of the past, I would rather see every ancient artwork destroyed than have this continued cycle of death and suffering of living people, of human beings. But I also think that we can only truly attempt to eliminate both if we understand and acknowledge how art and archaeological destruction and looting is not just random violence. It's not just religious extremism. It's a strategy. It's a strategy of war in which our pain, our outrage, and our impulse to buy artworks in order to save them have all been calculated, have all been relied upon. And one of the best ways of stopping it next time is to not participate, and especially not to buy the beautiful antiquities. It's hard to say no, I understand that, I know that. But if we reward terrorists for these heinous acts, if we literally give them money, it will likely be used to directly fund further terrorism and the further suffering and death of human beings. Rather than only mourning what we have lost, let us be inspired to say no to that beautiful and exciting purchase, and hopefully thereby save not just the art, but the people too. Thank you.